Hello friends, in this session we will discuss on sustainable development and environmental accounting. Let us begin with the introduction. Environmental problems are involving critical and complex policy matters. The dilemma that belongs equally to all but not equally accessible to all is puzzling in environmental subject, especially with regard to common property resources and common pool resources. Basically, it is a matter of natural resource management and endowment. If we can well define the common property resource and properly understand the links between the CPRs and PPRs as well as the issue involved therein, we can properly design the environmental policy and can make it effective and efficient. A. Common property resources, LDCs and sustainable development. To understand resource management systems, it is fundamental to take note of the institutional framework in which the resources are allocated for production and consumption. Most basic in this process of economic management are the factor endowments and their ownership patterns. This is the question of property rights. Property right is an institutional system in which the ownership and management of various resources are identified and specified. In other words, property right is a right of ownership by legal assertion which makes exchange possible and hence market prevalence. Alternative forms of property rights are private, public, joint, state, common property and open access. Accordingly, the associated resources, goods and services are designated as private resource and goods, public goods, state-owned goods, common property resources and open access resources. Now we will look at the environment and economy linkages in India. In this table, different states of India are mentioned in column 1. Column 2 shows per capita income 1993-94 in rupees. Column 3 is mean income of the poor 1993-94 in rupees per year. Column 4 is Gini ratio per capita income. Column 5 is for San Poverty Index. Column 6 shows deforestation between 1987 and 1997 in percentage. Column 7 stands for total wasteland as percentage of area in 1988-1990. Column 8 is head count ratio as percentage of NCAER 1994 and column 9 shows population density 1991. For example, if we look at the state Orissa, per capita income 1993-94 is 3028 rupees. Mean income of the poor 1993-94 is 1319 rupees per year. Gini ratio per capita income is 0.42. San Poverty Index is 0.30. Deforestation between 1987 and 1997 is minus 11.70%. Total wasteland as percentage of area in 1988-1990 is 13.31. Head count ratio as percentage of NCAER 1994 is 55 and population density 1991 is 203. Like Orissa, we can see the details of Bihar, West Bengal, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Assam, Karnataka, Uttar Pradesh, Kerala, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Andhra Pradesh, Haryana and Punjab. Definitions of common property resources CPRs. It is good to start with a definition of common property resource which is quite acceptable to most students of economics. A property on which group are established, the use of the resource is subtractive, having the characteristic of public good such as indivisibility, shall be termed as common property resource. The examples of common property resources are common grazing grounds, village panchayat lands and tanks, buffer areas or certain types of forest assigned to the communities, in some cases roads, water bodies and so on. We can also add biodiversity and local knowledge in the category of CPRs, provided the rules of the game are well defined. In traditional societies, CPRs are either collectively owned or the community has exclusive user rights. Many of the rights are conventionally defined rather than imposed by the state through law. There are two basic characteristics of all common property resources. First, a well-defined group or community has to have the exclusive rights on the use of the resource. There is the non-excludability condition that no member of that community can be excluded from the use of the resource. However, no single individual in the group has any exclusive property rights on those resources. Second, the use of resource is subtractive in the sense that use of it by any user would reduce the welfare of other members of the group. On a practical ground, however, there are a few additional characteristics. Number one, almost like a public good, there can be some degree of indivisibility of the resource. Second, a particular group or community can have exclusive rights on the use and access to the resource without ownership rights. Third, exclusion of users outside the group to those resource is often problematic. Fourth, there ought to be a set of rules regarding the use of the resource and sharing its benefits. And finally, number 5, there ought to be an institution within the group to impose rules and regulations outside of the legal institutions such as courts. The definition of CPR should have some further riders such as all members of the group have equal user rights without ownership rights. The group has rights to exclude another group from its use. Rules on the responsibilities on management and sharing should be defined and developed by the group itself. Common property resource assumes the nature of open access or fugitive resource whenever one or the other characteristics mentioned here are violated. A much referred to problem with common property resources is the tragedy of the commons. Whenever any of the set rules and regulations characterized for CPR are violated, individual rules and regulations characterized for CPR are violated. Individual choice may prevail over the social choice. It is very rational for an individual to over-extract or overuse the CPR and yet not to be responsible individually for the damage. It is in such a situation that the CPR assumes the nature of open access resource. With the experience of privately owned resources being managed by communities in several parts of India, for example, Chakriya Vikas Pranali in Bihar, one can add another category of resource, the commonly pooled private resource CPPR. This is a situation in which people, while retaining their individual or private property rights, pool their resources to collectivize and manage it together. Once again, as in the case of common property resources, management of such resources ought to have the conditions of excludability, subtractiveness, and rules of sharing. The only added characterization is that because of retention of their individual property rights, The individuals also keep the rights of withdrawing from the pool at any time unless the poolers frame rules of penalty and restrictions on withdrawal. Number 2. Linkage between CPR and PPR. In the context of sustainable development, how are the private property resources PPR and common property resources CPR related? The manual dependence between resources is quite well known among the users of those resources. In traditional economic thinking, they are treated more as substitutable. Known examples are substitution of good topsoil and nutrient contents, a CPR, by chemical fertilizer, a PPR, fuel wood by LPG or electricity, and so on. In many economic models, even land, be it a CPR or PPR, itself is treated as substitutable by man-made capital. An example is an air conditioner replacing an open landscape. On the contrary, in the context of sustainable development, it is the complementarity between CPR and PPR that needs to be understood in theory and strengthened in practice. Economic theory has dealt with complementarity problems very marginally, with the exception of Hicks in 1939, who devoted one entire chapter to it. In rural economic setting, households own private property resources such as cultivable land, livestock, agricultural equipment, private wells, seeds, fertilizers, and so on. The productivity of these private resources depends not only on the quality and quantity of such resources, but also upon access to a number of common property resources such as forest or village grassland, leaf biomass from forest, water harvesting and retailing structures, non-timber forest products, and the most important source of energy, namely fuel wood. In other words, there is a very high level of complementarity between these two types of resources. Macro level data on these two resources taken from Indian states are clearly indicating that there is considerable degree of complementarity between CPR and PPR. The estimated correlation coefficient between CPR and PPR is 0.8. as against the total CPRs of 74 million hectares among the major states in India, PPR are 178 million hectares. Number 3. Sustainable development and CPR management. In the context of sustainable development, SD, how should the CPRs be viewed? The dependency of PPR on CPR is a major component of sustainable development. Going by the characterization of it, SD also requires to maintain CPRs in the interest of all generations to come. In other words, their sustenance should be linked to resilience, equity, and then growth, and not the other way round. CPR, which is known as common property resources, is equal to private lands having some access to the commons plus permanent pastures and grazing lands plus cultivable wasteland plus follow other than current plus protected and unblazed forest lands. Talking of equity, there is a very significant linkage between CPR and the poor. The poor people often depend significantly upon the products of CPR. Good examples are collection of fuel wood, fodder and non-timber forest products, water, and even public utilities such as public toilets and bathing places. The poor are not only the beneficiaries of CPRs but also provide CPR inputs such as local knowledge and community labor. According to Jodha in 1986, about 30% of labor and small farmers in Rajasthan consume only CPR food items. In Madhya Pradesh, this dependency is 50%. In Rajasthan, about 42% of household income is from CPR. Only according to him, about 80% of the rural poor depend on CPRs for food and almost 100% for fuel, fodder and fiber. As far as development is concerned, according to the World Resources Institute in 1990, nearly 500 million people in India depend upon non-timber forest products (NTFP) for their livelihood. According to one estimate, NTFP collection generates about 1063 million man days of employment in India. In other words, CPRs provide a significant component of income and growth of the masses. Finally, CPRs can provide livelihood supports and resilience when the regular crop or other forms of income fail due to droughts, foods, earthquake, etc. During the periods of major droughts, the poor tribals of Chota Nagpur Plateau depend on local roots and tubers grown in the forest and survive. In the 1987-88 drought period, grasslands saved millions of livestock in India. Number 4. Evolution of CPR regime and institutions. In the context of natural resource management with CPRs, two questions emerge. First, when is a common property regime relevant? Second, how does it emerge? These questions can be answered if one looks at CPR from the point of view of both efficiency and sustainable institutions to manage them. Can one view a CPR regime as a case of scale economies? Here, both carrying capacity of the resource and efficiency criteria are to be considered. Consider for the moment three alternative management regimes: private, CPR and open access, leaving out for the moment state as another alternative. As illustrated in this figure, considering land productivity as an indicator of efficiency up to a level X, private ownership is preferable. Beyond X, CPR management has an edge over private management. Open access is in any case a fallout of failure of CPR or even private resource management and is least efficient. Evolution of CPR institutions takes place either when private resource management fails in terms of cost efficiency, or because of scale advantages of the resource, or when the state fails to manage the resource as a public good. In the first instance, owners of private resources may even hand over or sell their small and marginal resources for creating CPRs. In the second instance of large-scale resource, they may ask the state to intervene to take over the resource for better management. Example of the first is pooling of small and fragmented private lands of low productivity to create a CPR institution. A good example of such a situation is the Chakriya Vikas Pranali, an institution operating in Bihar in which poor tribals and small farmers of Chota Nagpur regions have pooled their private lands to create a commonly pooled private resource. Example of the second is the state or government managing large irrigation systems, forest resource and community grazing lands. Thus, there are three broad strands of thought through which institutions have evolved to manage CPRs. First, historically traditional societies have evolved systems to manage them through a process of conflicts, learning and mechanisms to resolve them. That is how village republics have emerged in India and elsewhere. Basically, total conventions have prevailed to guide the use patterns of such resources. The tribals of India have always dealt with this issue in this evolutionary manner. The institution of shifting cultivation in northeastern India is a good example. Second comes the process of customary laws introduced by the government empowering the local communities to enjoy several CPRs, for example, fuel, wood, NTFP. For instance, the Indian National Forest Policy document of 1988 clearly recognized the rights and the concessions to tribes and locals regarding grazing, collection of non-timber forest products, NTFP, etc. The third strain of CPR institutions emerges whenever the market mechanism fails to manage and maintain, or failure on the part of the state to police the public resources. Examples are the emergence of Joint Forest Management (JFM) institutions introduced by various states in India, or the 73rd Amendment to the Constitution of India introducing Panchayat Raj institutions. Number 5. Extent of CPR in India. How much of CPRs are there in India and how do we identify them? This identification process is not easy. Wherever by law such property rights are mentioned, it is a matter of counting them, but in traditional societies and in many developing countries, quite often such rights are established beyond law by conventions and traditions. Simple examples are the sacred groves in the Himalayan and Western Ghat forest, village common grazing grounds, or tanks or buffer areas of forest for villages to have usufruct rights for their fuel wood, leaf biomass, fodder, and several non-timber forest products. Some understanding has, however, emerged among revenue, forest and other developmental administrators about the categories of land that can come under CPRs in a country like India. The components to be included are private lands to which common access may exist, PLCPR, cultivable wastelands, CWL, permanent pastures and grazing lands, PPG, other than current follow, OTHFL, protected and unclaimed forest lands, PROT plus UNCL, total non-forest common property land resource, PLCPR plus CWL plus PPG plus OTHFL, total common property resource, forest and non-forest together, TOT NFCPR plus PROT plus UNCL. Land use categories eligible to be called CPRs. That part of land which, though officially classified as privately owned but allowed partial common access, it is not shown. Cultivable waste, partial user rights by convention. Follow other than current, user rights by convention. Common pastures and grazing land, user rights by law as well as convention. Barren and uncultivable lands, user rights by convention. Protected or partially and unclaimed lands, user rights by law and convention. There is considerable degree of variation in the extent of CPR in different states in India and over time. 4 indicators can be suggested to compare CPR across the states and to analyze the changes over time. Ratio of CPR to geographical area, per capita CPR area, ratio of CPR to wastelands, ratio of CPR in 2 time periods. Using these indicators between states, some major inference are: number 1, CPR as a percentage of geographical area range between 4 and 30% in different states, bearing such states as Himachal Pradesh, which are known to have protected forest CPRs. In the northeastern states and other hilly regions, the non-forest CPRs are relatively less. 3 broad groups can be made on the basis of CPR intensities. A. States where the CPR area is low, being less than or around 10% of geographical area. In this category are Punjab, Haryana, Andhra Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal and Kerala. Punjab and Haryana have a high level of agricultural development. A larger percentage of land under private ownership and a low level of forest area per capita exist. Uttar Pradesh and Andhra Pradesh, by virtue of being states comprising diverse agro-climate zones, exhibit the marginal characteristics. B. States where the CPR area falls in the range of around 10 to 30%. A number of states such as Bihar, Gujarat, Karnataka, Maharashtra, Orissa, Tamil Nadu and Tripura. C. The outliers with more than 30% area under CPRs. Rajasthan has a CPR area of around 42%, not because of forest area but by the nature of land use patterns. Himachal Pradesh and Jammu and Kashmir, on account of being hilly states, show varying characteristics. This is because of large areas of protected forest in Himachal Pradesh, which make the area under CPRs unduly high, and similarly, large areas in the category of reserve forest exist in Jammu and Kashmir, which decrease the CPR area to an usually low level. Number 2, it is found that in majority of the states there has occurred a decrease in the land to which CPR rights exist. Per capita CPR land has also gone down. These decreases are more pronounced in the arid and semi-arid states of Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Karnataka and Rajasthan. Conclusion: the problem of common property resources in the context of environmental and development nexus is difficult and complex, but it could be made easy and simple by proper definition of right, appropriate structure of institutions and prudent development policies and planning. The developing countries are not much in grip of the CPRs and PPRs, their linkages and planning. There are efforts put in and resources are allocated for the purpose, but they are small and insufficient. Thank you.